A desiccated face rests beneath glass. Its skin is thin and papery. Cratered scars crawl across cheeks and forehead. The eye sockets hold only shadow. A museum label names the person, not the disease. But the scars speak in a language older than the label. They say a virus once touched this life and changed it forever. The first glance is intimate. You imagine fingers tracing those grooves centuries ago. You imagine someone trying to soothe a burning fever. The wounds are small and regular. They are not random. They follow the pattern modern doctors recognise at once. Scholars point to similar wounds in Egypt. One of the clearest examples lies in a royal tomb, Ramses V, around 1157 before the Common Era. His face shows the same cratered map as the museum specimen. Many historians read those marks as smallpox. That reading carries consequences. It pushes smallpox back into deep antiquity. It puts the disease beside the rise of kingdoms and early cities. It makes smallpox a companion of civilization itself. Where human bodies clustered, the virus found opportunity. Mummies are not the only evidence. Fragments of medical writing survive across continents. Physicians in China took notes on eruptive fevers. Teachers in India catalogued patterns of rash and recovery. Writers in the Mediterranean recorded outbreaks and symptoms. These scattered descriptions carry a single theme. They describe a fever followed by pustules, then scabs, then scars. Those clinical fragments mattered. They moved smallpox from myth into observation. People stopped treating it as purely supernatural. They began to see a repeatable disease with a predictable course. That recognition seeded practical responses. Those responses would evolve across centuries. In the Islamic world, a physician took a crucial step. Al-Razi. Around the 10th century, he wrote a treatise comparing smallpox to measles. He argued they were distinct illnesses with different outcomes. He described how smallpox left its characteristic pockmarks. His clarity mattered because it allowed diagnosis by signs alone. Doctors could follow the disease, not just fear it. In China and India, physicians recorded similar clinical patterns. Their notes included timing, progression, and complications. They described how patients alternated between violent eruptions and quiet lulls. They wrote which wounds healed and which left deep pits. Those notes made nursing and care more systematic. They made contagion something to be studied, not only prayed against. Recognition led to rituals and practical measures. Some cultures isolated the sick during outbreaks. Some households developed routines for handling infected clothing. Families learned to bury the dead more quickly. Communities adapted funeral rites to reduce contact with contagion. These were not always medical decisions. They were social responses born from observation and fear. The disease's physical marks also shaped memory. Survivors carried a permanent map of their illness across their faces. Those scars told neighbours stories of survival and loss. They marked bodies in ways that altered marriage prospects and social roles. In some places, survivors acquired a grim form of respect for having endured. In other places, the marks branded people with stigma and caution. Early names for the disease reflect that imprint. Latin scribes used the word variola, meaning spotted. Arabic physicians wrote of Judari or smallpox specifically. Local terms carried images of spots and pox in every tongue. Language locked the disease into culture. That linguistic embedding made smallpox more than a health problem. Physical evidence and written records together built knowledge. They enabled empirical experiments long before modern laboratories. In some provinces, communities tested controlled exposures to produce milder disease. These practices varied widely in technique and intent. They were risky. They also showed a basic public health logic. The idea was simple and ancient. Exposure could change future outcomes. Those early practices evolved over centuries into formal techniques. They rested on the fact that smallpox followed a predictable course. They relied on the observation that survivors rarely got the disease twice. That observation turned scars into an informal record of immunity. It is the same observation that centuries later led to variolation. and variolation would later become vaccination, changing the fight entirely. Archaeology and text together reveal a stubborn truth. Smallpox was not a latecomer to human history. It did not arrive with industrialization or colonial voyages alone. It existed when kings built pyramids and when cities first grew crowded. It shaped families, laws, healing arts, and funerary rites long before modern medicine. This ancientness made smallpox uniquely difficult to eradicate. The disease had been woven into customs and coping mechanisms. People adapted habits that made sense in their time. Those habits sometimes resisted outside intervention. Eradication would require changing not just bodies but practices and beliefs. Standing before the glass, you see another consequence. Human remains make disease intimate and unavoidable. They erase distance between past victims and present observers. The dried skin is not an abstraction. It is a person who endured heat, delirium, and a wary household. It is a life interrupted in ways words can only outline. That intimacy helps explain later tensions. Efforts to prevent smallpox often collided with ritual and tradition. Some communities clung to older remedies or resisted foreign techniques. Efforts based solely on laboratory breakthroughs overlooked that reality. Successful responses would need both science and cultural negotiation. The ancient record also delivers an uncomfortable warning. When a disease has existed for millennia, habits calcify. Fear becomes embedded in law, in religion, and in everyday practice. Once entrenched, such habits require more than facts to change. They demand trust, conversation, and practical alternatives. The museum case closes on a quiet fact. Those pockmarks connect a distant person to a modern struggle. They make clear that eradication would not be only a scientific triumph. It would be a cultural one as well. The world would have to relearn how to care for bodies, not just how to classify microbes. Across centuries, the arc of knowledge bends toward practical steps, from papyrus notes to parchment, from temple practices to physician treatises. That slow accumulation allowed later generations to try deliberate prevention. It set the stage for targeted experiments and public health campaigns. But every step forward carried the weight of older responses. Eradication would mean rewriting those responses across continents. In this room, the face under glass is both relic and warning. It urges restraint against simple triumphalism. It insists on humility about the cultural costs of fighting disease. It asks listeners to remember that bodies tell political stories. It reminds us that medicine is woven into daily life, not apart from it. So the first chapter closes the way it began, with a single, scarred face that refuses to be anonymous, with the knowledge that smallpox was present at the dawn of complex societies, with the understanding that later victories would require changing human habits, with the sense that eradication would be as much about culture as microbiology. These are the bones of the story. They will shape every later decision, every strategy, every sacrifice. They will remind those who fought that the enemy lived among us for millennia. And they will make the final victory over smallpox feel less like a sudden miracle. It will feel instead like the last page of a very long, very hard chapter in human history. In the 20th century alone, historians estimate 300 to 500 million people died from smallpox. A hand on a fevered forehead can carry that number into human terms. Put your hand there for a moment. Feel the heat. That small motion repeats across continents and centuries. Variola major killed roughly 1 in 3 infected people. 1 in 3. Variola minor carried a far lower fatality. In communities with no prior exposure, mortality sometimes rose above 50%. Entire villages disappeared in a single wave. In the Americas, disease arrived before many conquerors set foot inland. Smallpox reshaped demographic maps in the 16th century. Populations that once numbered in the millions fell to a fraction. That collapse eased imperial conquest and seized land for colonizers. The loss was political as well as human. In the Pacific Islands, epidemics travelled faster than ships. Captain-seasoned traders carried pox across ocean routes. Islands lost elders and leaders within months. Loss of leadership meant social orders broke apart. Young survivors inherited responsibilities too soon. In parts of Africa, endemic smallpox meant repeated grieving seasons. Communities reorganised around the ordinary expectation of loss. High childhood mortality drove family planning and labour decisions. Parents expected some children would not reach adulthood. They had more children as an insurance strategy. That pattern altered population growth for generations. Economies adjusted to perpetual instability. Harvests failed when healthy workers fell sick or died. Markets stalled when quarantine measures closed ports and roads. A shipment could vanish under isolation orders. Colonial administration spent scarce resources on containment and vaccination campaigns. Those campaigns were expensive and imperfect. Vaccine supply lines broke in monsoon seasons and civil strife. The costs were fiscal and social. Tax revenue shrank after a major outbreak. Young men and women failed to enter the workforce. Craft guilds and plantations lost skilled hands. Inheritance patterns shifted when whole families perished. Property passed abruptly to distant relatives or to colonial officials. Public orders faltered while funerals and burials mounted. Medical systems strained under constant caseloads. Smallpox was not merely a medical problem. It was a governance problem. It was an economic drag on developing and industrial states alike. By the 19th century, European cities still counted smallpox among their leading killers. Rural districts felt it too, with seasonal epidemics returning predictably. In some regions, scars from smallpox marked a lifetime. Scarring influenced marriage prospects and social mobility. A pockmarked face could mean exclusion from certain trades. That cultural cost reduced opportunities for survivors. The disease's reach was unequal but relentless. It hit children and adults, and sometimes whole families. Those deaths add up quickly when repeated across decades. The 20th century's horrifying tally reflects accumulation and persistence. Outbreaks did not vanish. They persisted and rebounded. Medical advances reduced deaths in some places, but wars, migration and poverty allowed smallpox to spread anew. Refugee camps and battlefields became ideal environments for contagion. After 2 world wars, the global map had new vulnerabilities. Borders opened unevenly. Colonial empires dissolved. New nation-states grappled with public health crises. The World Health Organization formed in 1948 to coordinate global responses. Public health moved from charity to statecraft. Disease control became an instrument of economic planning. Governments measured children's survival as a development indicator. A healthier childhood cohort meant a stronger labour force later. Investing in vaccination could be calculated as an investment. Policymakers looked at the math. They compared lives saved to dollars spent. They considered tax revenue preserved through fewer deaths. They weighed political stability restored by fewer epidemics. In those calculations, smallpox loomed as a solvable drag on progress. International conferences began to treat smallpox differently than other diseases. It had no animal reservoir and an effective vaccine. Those facts changed the cost calculus. Ending the disease would yield permanent benefits. 1967. That year marked the launch of a stepped-up international campaign. Officials had been preparing for years. They now had clearer evidence of both mortality and opportunity. Leaders from diverse nations saw the logic. Eradication moved from ideal to feasible. The argument was simple and stark. Spend now. Save lives. Save economies. Save future generations from recurring plagues. This rationale appealed to humanitarian instincts and fiscal prudence alike. It bridged ideological divides in a tense global era. Cold War rivals found common cause against a common killer. For many political leaders, the decision was practical as well as moral. They could present vaccination as economic policy. They could promise workforce stability and lower public health costs. That message resonated in development ministries and in parliaments. It won budgets and logistical support. It attracted nurses, vaccinators and laboratory staff. It drew the attention of donors and of field epidemiologists. Numbers drove action. 300 to 500 million deaths in a single century demanded a response. The scale of loss made eradication more than an ideal. It made eradication a social imperative. On the ground, techniques varied by place. In crowded cities, mass campaigns sought to blanket populations quickly. In remote villages, teams pursued ring vaccination and contact tracing. Each approach responded to local realities and resources, yet the same hand touched a fevered forehead everywhere. A mother in a mountain village felt molten heat and fear. A father in a delta saw coughing siblings lose weight and awareness. A village elder counted grandchildren who would not be buried. Those individual moments accumulated into national calamities. They informed policy papers and budget requests in capital cities. They appeared in reports to international agencies. They shaped the political will needed for large, sustained campaigns. Deaths also created memory. Whole generations remembered the dread of outbreaks. That cultural memory kept demand for intervention alive. Survivors told stories that pressured local authorities to act. Those stories became part of electoral politics in some countries. Candidates promised better health services to win votes. The smallpox burden also inspired scientific responses. Clinicians refined vaccine delivery, storage, and production methods. Cold chain technology improved because vaccines required it. That infrastructure later supported other public health programs. Eradication would return societal dividends beyond lives saved. It freed up resources for education, roads, and economic development. It freed communities from the recurring ritual of mourning. Ending smallpox would also be symbolic. It would prove that coordinated global action could defeat a major disease. That symbolism mattered in diplomatic corridors and development banks. It justified spending that might otherwise have been politically risky. So the math and the moral case converged. The number of lives lost was not an abstract statistic anymore. Each counted life translated into a calculation of lost productivity, disrupted families and governance strain. The hand on the fevered forehead became data. It became charts and budgets and training manuals. It became the argument that sustained a global campaign. Understanding the scale reframes eradication as rational investment, not mere scientific triumph. The work that followed drew on that sober arithmetic and on stubborn compassion. It asked nations to commit resources and people to commit their hands to another's fevered forehead. That simple touch, multiplied millions of times, became the instrument of a global promise, a battlefield map, the looping handwriting of a conquistador. The first Europeans to reach the Americas carried more than guns. A woolen blanket lay folded in a ship's locker. It smelled faintly of lanolin and smoke. That blanket crossed oceans. It passed from sailor to merchant to governor and back again. Smallpox came with those ships. It arrived in the Americas like an invisible tide. It reached central Mexico in 1520. It moved faster than messengers or marching columns. The virus met people with no inherited defences. Whole neighbourhoods fell ill within days. Leaders died in swift succession. The city could not replace those who carried knowledge and command. City defences faltered. Food stores rotted. Fear replaced order. Tenochtitlan fell. 1521. Hernán Cortés stood among ruins that had already begun to empty. The Spanish flag rose over a capital hollowed by disease. That conquest is often remembered for steel and strategy. Disease did an equal and devastating part of the work. Farther west, on the high plateaus of the Andes, the same pattern repeated. Smallpox arrived before sustained Spanish control. An Inca ruler died of the disease. The death sparked a bloody succession war between rival claimants. Francisco Pizarro found an empire weakened, divided, and easier to conquer. he captured a ruler amid chaos. Across the Caribbean and the Gulf coasts, indigenous populations collapsed within decades of first contact. Columbus's landings in 1492 started chains of biological catastrophe. Villages emptied, sacred cemeteries filled. New maps were drawn on emptied land and silent rivers. Blankets, cloth, and trade goods figured in every crossing. They were ordinary items in a growing global market. Cloth was currency. It bought food, favours and alliances. It also carried the detritus of disease. Smallpox spreads in crowds and in homes. It travels on respiratory droplets and close contact. Contaminated bedding and clothing can carry infectious material. The scabs of smallpox patients harbour the virus for days. That biological fact made a blanket an unintentional vector. A single folded blanket could seed an outbreak in a distant village. In many confrontations, Europeans did not understand epidemiology. They did notice results. They noticed that population decline cleared resistance and opened land. They noticed that some communities vanished before armies arrived. Those observations hardened into policy over decades. Empires learned that disease reshaped political terrain as effectively as treaties did. Colonial officials sometimes embraced that learning with brutal calculation. The line between accident and intent blurred in shadowed council rooms. The most chilling proof appears in correspondence from the British Empire during Pontiac's War. Native confederations rose against British posts in the Ohio country in 1763. Lord Geoffrey Amherst wrote letters in which he discussed using smallpox to subdue hostile tribes. He proposed distributing infected blankets and other items at a moment of crisis. The letters do not invent the idea of biological harm. They record a decision to consider disease as weaponry. Whether every distribution caused the infections that followed remains debated. The moral fact is plain. Colonial leaders entertained the deliberate use of contagion. That choice cracked trust. For indigenous communities, medicine and betrayal began to look indistinguishable. Oral histories carried the memory of blankets arriving as gifts or as tokens. Those memories hardened into generational suspicion of outsiders and their supposed remedies. The blanket became more than cloth in memory. It became proof of calculated harm. It became an emblem of the political violence disease could perform. Smallpox's role in empire went beyond tactical advantage. Demographic collapse reshaped labour, governance, and economy across continents. Plantation owners found themselves with vast land and too few hands. Colonists sought labour in other markets when indigenous populations could not be forced into servitude. That shortage helped drive the expansion of the Atlantic slave trade. European demand for labour linked to African trafficking and reshaped global human flows. New colonial administrations rose atop emptied communities. Viceroyalties, charter colonies, and crown lands reorganised societies on a scale of catastrophe. Local institutions broke down. Religious hierarchies, trade networks, and diplomatic ties evaporated with the people who maintained them. Religion itself changed. Missionaries found converts among survivors who had seen entire worlds vanish. That conversion often followed coercion and dispossession. Across the Pacific, the pattern reappeared as European exploration accelerated. Ships sailing to Tahiti, Tonga, and Hawaii carried more than curiosity. Traders, whalers, and naval expeditions introduced pathogens to isolated islanders. Those societies had no prior exposure and no immunity. Epidemics reduced populations, toppled chiefs, and altered alliances. Colonial influence crept in where demographic collapse undermined traditional authority. Cloth again moved in those exchanges. Blankets, shirts, and trade fabrics were ordinary items in Pacific forges of contact. They heated huts and wrapped corpses. They carried flecks of infectious material that could spark local clusters. The ordinary nature of these objects disguised the extraordinary consequences they could produce. A single cloth could bind a personal loss to an imperial design. Not every outbreak was intentional. Most were accidents of contact and commerce. But the possibility of intentional infection haunted relationships. Colonial officials saw utility in that possibility. They discussed and at times attempted it. Those efforts left scars deeper than any one epidemic. Communities that survived wrote treaties under suspicion. Diplomacy required negotiation with a background knowledge of deliberate harm. Medicine suffered in reputation where politics and contagion intersected. Doctors and healers struggled to convince populations resistant to external help. This distrust complicated later public health efforts. When vaccination arrived, some communities greeted it with suspicion born of earlier betrayals. The shadow of a blanket returned in other contexts. Memorials and stories preserved the detail of a cloth as an instrument of harm. That memory shaped resistance. It also shaped legal claims and later apologies. The fact of intentional consideration mattered as much as any one act. Smallpox forced the map to change. Empires expanded into places cleared by disease. New economies developed on the ruins of old ones. The disease rebalanced power along lines that favoured colonists. It shortened wars, hollowed defences, and turned military campaigns into land grabs. It also created moral problems that outlived immediate victories. The deliberate contemplation of contagion revealed how readily political goals could justify inhumanity. Those choices left political trauma in their wake. Indigenous communities remember more than lives lost. They remember the instruments and choices that made loss possible. The blanket, folded and stained, appears again and again in those memories. It binds the macro to the intimate. It ties a captain's chest to a chief's hearth. It links an administrative letter to a grieving family. It makes the vast machinery of empire tangible. By the late 18th century, the global consequences were clear. Empires had used and been aided by disease as they extended authority. That fact reframes conquest. Empires did not win solely by technology or strategy. They also profited from biological advantage. Understanding that advantage matters for how history is remembered. It matters for questions of justice, apology, and reparative policy today. Smallpox did not only kill people, it altered the balance of power between peoples across continents and oceans. It accelerated colonial projects and seeded political trauma that echoes to today. The woolen blanket is a witness, ordinary and terrible, to that unfolding. In a kitchen, a woman leans over a wooden table with steady hands. She cradles a dried smallpox scab between forefinger and thumb. The scab flakes like old bread when she rubs it gently. It smells faintly of smoke and the iron tang of sweat. A child sleeps on a rush mat nearby, breath shallow, cheeks soft. She takes a tiny knife and scrapes the scab into fine powder. She mixes that powder with warm water until it becomes a paste. Then she makes a small prick on the boy's arm. She smears the paste into the wound and presses it down. A neighbour hums quietly while the child breathes, patient as a bell. This is variolation, deliberate exposure to material from a mild smallpox case. The goal is to provoke a lighter, controlled infection. It is a hands-on technology born of observation and necessity. It is also an intimate act performed in kitchens and courtyards. It moves by touch and memory, not by laboratory instruments. In China, healers powdered scabs and blew the powder into nostrils. They called it inserting the seed of the disease. They wrote rules about age, timing, and the right scab to use. In the Ottoman world, women practiced inoculation behind closed doors. A mother might carry her child to a household practitioner and return home. The practitioner used a needle or small knife to place matter into skin. Travellers noticed these practices and wrote home about them. Letters and reports crisscrossed seas long before scientific journals rose. 1717, Lady Mary Wortley Montagu. She watched an inoculation in Constantinople and described it in letters. She observed careful hands and steady rituals in private rooms. She watched the fevered child recover with only faint scars. She later had her own son variolated and championed the method in England. Her letters and her advocacy opened doors in British medical circles. Her voice helped seed Europe's first intentional preventive programs. Across the Atlantic, another thread of transmission crossed oceans. An enslaved man named Onesimus spoke of African inoculation methods in Boston. Cotton Mather recorded the account and argued for trial during an epidemic. In 1721, Zabdiel Boylston began inoculating patients in Boston. He faced hostility, threats, and public fury for his efforts. Yet many of his patients recovered more lightly than those infected naturally. These cross-cultural exchanges seeded experiments in new lands. Variolation often produced milder disease than natural infection. When it did, it lowered death rates in practicing communities. That change in outcomes shifted how families weighed risk and benefit. Parents accepted a short illness to dodge a deadly, disfiguring future. Communities that practiced variolation sometimes buried fewer children. Word of those successes travelled by word of mouth and by print. The practice was not without serious danger. Variolation could cause severe disease and death in some cases. Inoculated individuals sometimes became sources of new outbreaks. Poor technique or infected donors increased the peril. For that reason, skill and selection mattered enormously. Healers learned to choose scabs from mild cases to limit severity. They timed inoculations when fevers could be controlled and quarantines enforced. They watched donors closely and kept patients isolated until recovery. Methods varied widely across cultures and regions. In India, people used powdered scab or skin puncture techniques. In West Africa, communities employed their own ritualized methods for protection. Those methods travelled with traders, pilgrims, and the enslaved across oceans. In the Americas and the Caribbean, African knowledge reshaped local responses. Sometimes practice adapted to new climates and new social structures. Variolation was a community technology as much as a medical one. Midwives, grandmothers, and household healers were often the practitioners. Their knowledge was tactile, honed by scab texture and fever patterns. They felt the right donor scab like a farmer judges seed quality. They timed procedures by nights of sleep and days of appetite. They supplied reassurance as much as medical technique to families. They offered a calculated hope amid relentless fear. The one idea at the heart of this practice was simple. Controlled exposure could blunt smallpox's worst outcomes. That practical success mattered more than abstract doctrine for many. Religious leaders argued theology. Physicians argued risk. Families chose outcomes. Public authorities sometimes embraced controlled inoculation programs. Prisoners were inoculated in exchange for reduced sentences in some cities. Other municipalities set up inoculation houses to regulate the practice. In many places, however, the procedure remained private and informal. It circulated through markets, workshops, and the hidden networks of women. Controversy followed every effort to make inoculation public policy. Some saw it as defiance of God's will. Others feared physicians would be blamed for new outbreaks. Violent mobs sometimes attacked early practitioners for meddling with fate. The debate revealed more than medicine. It revealed how societies decide who controls risk and health. Still, the core empirical fact held. Variolation reduced mortality when practiced with care. It taught generations of practitioners that prevention could be deliberate. It gave people a language for controlled exposure and immunity. Those ideas travelled into clinics, study rooms, and political debates. The story of variolation is also a story of credit and erasure. The technique owed as much to nameless practitioners as to famous patrons. Enslaved healers and women in private homes preserved vital knowledge. Their hands and memories kept communities alive through recurring epidemics. Yet history often remembered the travellers and letter writers who carried the news. This method also rewired public imagination about disease. If exposure could protect, Perhaps a safer form of exposure could be found. That question sparked experiments and new lines of inquiry. It moved curiosity from the hearth to the experimental room. It nudged the medical world toward the idea of a controlled, safer substitute for smallpox itself. The payoff of these grassroots practices was more than technical. They changed the social calculus of prevention across continents. They normalized intentional, controlled intervention against infectious disease. They created communities of practice who could teach and refine technique. They proved the power of empiricism lived in kitchens and courtyards. We should pause and name the actors who made this possible. Not all were men in laboratories or official titles. Mothers, midwives, household healers, and enslaved practitioners led much of the work. They observed, tested, and passed on techniques across generations. They chose donors, gauged fevers, and tended the sick with quiet courage. Their expertise saved lives and bridged continents. Long before germ theory explained how microbes worked, people improvised defences. Those improvisations were practical, local, and often remarkably effective. They reduced death, created new public practices, and reframed risk. They also carried danger and provoked fierce debates. But they left a clear legacy. Variolation was not the final triumph. It was a step on a longer path towards safer prevention. It opened the conceptual door that Edward Jenner and others would later walk through. It made the idea of deliberate protective exposure thinkable and politically possible. Above all, variolation shows how ordinary people confronting extraordinary danger can innovate. In kitchens across continents, hands learned a new language of care. Those hands pressed powder into skin. Those hands watched fevers, counted breaths, and kept watch at night. They improvised science before science had formal institutions, and in that work they built the bridge to vaccination. She stands in a low-ceiling stable, one hand steadying a pail of milk. Light comes through a narrow window, dust motes turning slow in the beam. Her forearm shows a cluster of rough blistered spots, dark at the edges. The smell of hay and cow sweat hangs in the air around her. A country doctor watches from the doorway, coat dusted with chalk and clay. He listens more than he speaks, cataloguing what he sees and hears. The woman is a milkmaid named Sarah Nelmes. The doctor is Edward Jenner of Berkeley, Gloucestershire. What he notices is not the smell of the barn. What he notices is what the barn has left on her skin. For years, people in villages noticed milkmaids rarely bore the deep pockmarks of smallpox. That folk observation had no science behind it then. It did have a pattern. Jenner had heard the pattern many times. He had treated farmhouse families who feared smallpox more than any other danger. He had seen grief and poverty follow epidemics for decades. Curiosity in him was practical, not vanity. He wondered whether the cow-related sores could protect against human smallpox. To test that question, he chose a human subject. The subject was 8-year-old James Phipps, May 14th, 1796. Jenner took matter from Sarah Nelmes's cowpox lesions. He introduced that material into a small cut on James Phipps's arm. The boy developed a light fever and a few pustules. The symptoms were brief and mild. Jenner watched. He waited. Then he did the next, more dangerous thing. He exposed the boy to material from a smallpox sore. The usual procedure for such a test was called variolation. Variolation used human smallpox material to induce a mild infection, and hoped for immunity. In Phipps' case, the smallpox exposure produced no disease. The boy did not become ill with smallpox. That single experiment convinced Jenner of a protective principle. He called the practice vaccination, from the Latin word for cow, vacca. The word both named and explained the discovery. Jenner recorded his observations in careful clinical notes. He included dates, the appearance of the lesions, and the boy's recovery. He described the source of the cowpox, the milkmaid. He described how arm-to-arm transmission could carry protection. The evidence was simple and hard to ignore, but the method it suggested challenged an older established practice. For nearly a century before Jenner, variolation had been the main preventive tool. Variolation reduced the risk of natural smallpox, yet it came with real danger. Sometimes variolation caused full-blown smallpox and death. Sometimes variolation started new outbreaks. It also required deliberate infection with the very disease people feared. Jenner's cowpox breakthrough promised something different. It offered immunity without the same risk of severe disease or transmission. He saw a path from risky exposure to controlled prevention. He saw an entire public health practice that could change. Jenner faced institutional skepticism. The Royal Society initially declined his paper. He financed a private printing through subscribers. 1798. He published his work as an inquiry into the causes and effects of the variolae vaccinae. His title named the phenomenon and framed the argument as science. That book travelled faster than Jenner could. Ideas moved differently at the end of the 18th century. Letters, travelling physicians, merchant ships and soldiers carried the practice abroad. Surgeons learned to take cowpox matter and administer it in small incisions. Midwives, too, became vaccinators in many rural parishes. The method was simple enough for practical adoption. Its safety record compared favourably to variolation. Communities eager to avoid smallpox embraced it cautiously and then more widely. Yet adoption was not automatic. Some suspected danger in borrowing animal disease for human use. Some feared social and religious consequences of laboratory-like meddling. There were scandals about quacks and botched vaccinations. There were also moments of profound moral courage. Jenner himself risked reputation and trust when he experimented on a child. He carefully documented that risk and the outcome in public records. That record made his claim harder to dismiss. The theory behind the protection took longer to settle. Scientists later showed that cowpox and smallpox were related viruses. Exposure to one trained the immune system against the other. For practitioners of the time, the explanation came from observation first, theory later. The practical success drove the theory. Practically speaking, vaccination changed prevention strategy. It made planned, preemptive protection feasible on a mass scale. It reduced the need to wait for epidemic waves. It cut the chance that prevention itself would start a deadly outbreak. Because it was safer, vaccination spread not only through medical elites. Governments, missionaries and colonial administrators began to see public value. Naval and military surgeons carried vaccination across oceans. Armies that once feared smallpox began to use vaccination to preserve forces. The British Empire exported the method widely through those channels. So did France, Spain and other European states. The Ottoman Empire and the Russian court received vaccination through diplomatic exchanges. By the early 19th century, vaccination had become a global idea. Yet the path was never smooth or entirely benevolent. Early arm-to-arm vaccination sometimes transferred other infections. Commercial interests arose around vaccine production and supply. Public health would later need laws, funding and organisation to scale vaccination fairly. Those debates and fights belong to the next chapters of this story. For now, the moment in that barnyard mattered. A milkmaid with cowpox lesions, a country doctor with a notebook, an 8-year-old boy who bore a test. From that domestic scene came an idea that changed prevention forever. The elegance of the change was moral as well as scientific. It turned a dangerous practice that deliberately used the killer disease into a controlled, mild exposure. It turned an observation from everyday life into a reproducible medical intervention. It showed that practical knowledge and empirical curiosity could save lives. Clinics and state campaigns later relied on that transformation. Vaccination became the hinge between folk observation and modern public health. It made eradication conceivable, decades and centuries before the tools existed to finish the job. Jenner did not claim he had conquered smallpox. He presented a method and evidence, and then he dared others to test it further. That openness invited replication and refinement across continents. It also invited resistance and reform. The story of vaccination after Jenner would include triumph and messiness. It would include policy fights, legislation, and social anxiety. It would also include remarkable execution and scientific persistence. But the farmer's gift remained the pivot. A simple observation about milkmaids protected entire communities from catastrophe. That insight turned prevention from a gamble into a tool. It altered how societies thought about disease and responsibility. It shifted moral obligations toward collective protection, one arm at a time. When future generations would stand against the last smallpox cases, they would stand on Jenna's shoulders. They would also stand on hundreds of thousands of small domestic decisions to adopt vaccination. The quiet scene in a Gloucestershire stall was the origin point. One trial, carefully recorded, changed the calculus of public health. From barn smell and blistered skin rose an idea that would travel the globe. The practical genius of vaccination began in a household. That household choice would echo through every later campaign to stop smallpox. The next chapter carries the aftermath into streets and courts. It examines how communities wrestled with mandates, fear, and the demand to protect others. Here, in Jenna's barn, the lesson is clear and intimate. Science sometimes begins at the boundary between care and curiosity. A milkmaid's scars taught the world a new way to survive smallpox. A satirical cartoon hangs in the square, inked teeth bared, a nursehood turned into a circus. People laugh at first. Then a murmur moves through the crowd like a current. Outside a makeshift clinic, voices lower. A mother smooths her shawl and looks at her sleeping child. A father watches a government official write names in a ledger. This is the visible moment when medicine meets politics. In the 19th century, smallpox vaccination could not stay only in the surgery. In England and Wales, Parliament altered the relationship between state and family. In 1853, Parliament made vaccination compulsory for infants. Officials required infants be vaccinated within a set number of weeks after birth. That law made a private wound into public responsibility. It also made private refusal into a punishable offence. The law arrived after decades of uneven practice and patchwork provision. Local parishes and charity clinics had long offered the cowpox procedure. Some families paid, some families did not. The new act changed the calculus. It promised protection, it promised uniformity, it also promised enforcement. Many welcomed the promise. Public health authorities spoke of preventing dread and death. Doctors argued they could keep entire neighbourhoods safe. But mandates folded into existing social fault lines. They forced households to choose between compliance and conscience. A mother at the clinic described the choice differently than a doctor. She worried the vaccine would leave permanent marks on her baby's face. She feared medical strangers prying into newborn life. She feared the state could, one day, demand more. For many, these fears were as real as infection. Political groups moved quickly to organise that fear. Pamphlets appeared, cartoons multiplied, meetings gathered at taverns and town halls. People who'd never joined a political society found common cause. The first anti-vaccination leagues took shape in this atmosphere. They were not a single, simple movement. They included artisans, clerics, parents, and some dissenting physicians. They argued that compulsion violated liberty and the sanctity of the body. They charged that the state was overreaching into home life. Confrontations followed. Local vaccinators reported hostile streets and threatened appointments. Sometimes vaccinators were pelted. Sometimes they were simply ignored. Officials prosecuted some parents for non-compliance. Fines and court summonses became a blunt instrument of policy. Prosecution produced headlines and hardened opinion on both sides. The legal battles mattered. Courts had to decide whether the state could demand medical procedures. Judges balanced public safety against individual rights. Their rulings layered precedent upon precedent. Those precedents informed policy for decades to come. When enforcement increased, resistance intensified. In 1867, Parliament toughened enforcement measures. The result was a sharper line between dissent and compliance. That sharper line pushed anti-vaccination organisers to new intensity. Their rhetoric often used the language of liberty. They spoke of parental sovereignty and personal conscience. They connected vaccination to tax, to authority, to class power. Working-class communities sometimes read mandates as another form of domination. And in communities that distrusted government, health orders bore the flavour of intrusion. Yet the movement had other faces. Some objectors raised genuine safety concerns. Vaccination techniques were uneven in quality and practice. Sometimes an infected human arm was used to pass the vaccine. Sometimes infections other than cowpox were transmitted unintentionally. These failures undermined public trust in the programme's competence. The story of smallpox vaccination in the 19th century is therefore two stories. One story is science moving forward, the other is trust lagging behind. Science offered a tool. Trust determined whether that tool would be wielded. These tensions forced governments into awkward compromise. Authorities could not rely solely on police and courts to deliver public health. They also needed persuasion, education, and local legitimacy. Public health officers slowly learned to use carrot and not only stick. They organised free vaccination clinics with kind nurses. They distributed literature that explained procedure and expected outcomes. They engaged local leaders to speak in favour of vaccination. Local campaigns had uneven success. In some towns, persuading midwives and clergy proved decisive. In others, enforcement remained the blunt default. The law itself shifted in response to politics and pressure. By the end of the century, Parliament offered exemptions for conscience. The concession recognised that legal force had political and social costs. It also recognised that medicine needed popular cooperation. For parents, these legal shifts were not abstract. They narrowed choices in one decade, they widened them in another. A mother could be fined, or she could be recognised as a conscientious objector. Both outcomes carried social consequences. A refusal could mark a family as rebellious. A compliance could earn suspicion from neighbours who distrusted government. The anti-vaccination movement refined its tools. It brought petitions to Parliament. It fed stories to sympathetic newspapers. It mobilised court cases that tested constitutional principles. Those tactics forced public debate. They forced politicians to answer not only with medicine, but with argument. At the same time, public health administrations improved their practice. They standardised vaccine production. They trained vaccinators in proper technique. They monitored adverse events more carefully. Those improvements reduced genuine grounds for some objections. But improvements rarely erased distrust entirely. The crises of trust produced unexpected alliances. A liberal newspaper might criticise enforcement while supporting vaccination itself. A conservative magistrate might oppose heavy-handed policing of homes. Medical reformers argued that persuasion required visible competence. They insisted transparency and apology where mistakes occurred. The cumulative lesson was practical and moral. Public health required authority and legitimacy simultaneously. Authority without legitimacy courted resistance. Legitimacy without authority risked ineffectiveness. Policy became a craft of balance. This architecture appeared again and again. It resurfaced in 20th century campaigns against diphtheria, polio and measles. It shaped how colonial administrators sought to vaccinate distant peoples, and it shaped the strategies used in the global smallpox campaign a century later. By the 1960s, international teams knew the limits of force. They also understood the value of community negotiation and local leadership. The personal cost of the 19th century debates was enormous. Children continued to die of smallpox while adults argued over law. Families fractured under the strain of public shaming and fines. Some physicians were vilified for their zeal. Some anti-vaccination organisers were ridiculed for fear-mongering. The social temperature often reached cruelty. In the quiet moments, ordinary choices felt heavy. A midwife weighed loyalty to her trade against loyalty to the state. A shopkeeper decided whether to sign a petition that could lose customers. A mother decided in a noisy clinic whether to hold her child still. These were not theoretical acts. They were decisions about a baby's skin and breath. When historians look back, they see more than caricature. They see a society wrestling to define the boundary between public good and private life. They see the birth of policy tools later taken for granted. They see how legal frameworks shaped public trust for generations. 2 dates mark the arc of this chapter. 1853. The year vaccination became compulsory and turned a medical act into a legal duty. 1898. The year the law finally acknowledged conscience as a legitimate reason to decline. Those dates are punctuation marks. They do not end the debate, but they frame its logic. Mandates changed how states thought about health. Resistance changed how citizens thought about authority. From their collision emerged a governance model that mixed mandate, persuasion and concession. That model later underpinned mass immunization efforts worldwide. The story also leaves a moral echo. A policy that saves lives can still wound trust. A campaign that ignores social feeling will often fail on social ground. The final victory over smallpox depended on both a needle and a conversation. The cartoon in the square fades into memory. But the murmurs outside the clinic do not vanish. They become the low, persistent noise of democracy. They remind future public health leaders that health requires not only science and law, it requires legitimacy rooted in the lives and choices of real people. Telegram. Vaccine urgently needed. Armies and refugees crossing border. Outbreak spreading along supply routes. Please dispatch immediately. A simple message. 1 crate could mean the difference between life and death. That crate began the story of wartime science turning into global health. The telegram landed on a wooden desk in a provincial health office. It travelled faster than the disease it warned about. It triggered a chain that reached across continents. After the Second World War, the world kept the edges of its wartime map. Airfields stayed open. Ports kept their schedules. Railways that carried soldiers now carried nurses and vaccines. Military logistics taught a lesson. Mass movement could be organised. That lesson became vital for disease control. 1948. The World Health Organization opened its doors. The WHO was the new global vehicle for public health. It inherited old networks from colonial administrations and wartime missions. It built regional offices from Geneva to New Delhi to Brazzaville. Those regional offices spoke the languages of local ministries. They held lists of district officers and cold storage rooms. They understood how to move supplies under difficult conditions. Colonial public health departments supplied a scaffold. British, French, Dutch, and Belgian systems had staffed whole provinces. They had vaccination officers posted in remote districts. They had records, maps, and chains of command. When new nations emerged after decolonization, many retained those structures. Public servants stayed at their posts even as flags changed. That continuity mattered for any large-scale campaign. War laboratories became public health laboratories. During the war, vaccine production scaled to protect armies. That production capacity survived peacetime. It shifted from troop immunization to civilian campaigns. New production methods increased yield and stability. Freeze-dried vaccine kept potency through long sea voyages and tropical heat. The bifurcated needle appeared and changed field vaccination. A tiny forked instrument used tiny amounts of vaccine. It sped vaccination dramatically. Both innovations shrank logistical barriers into solvable problems. The Cold War shaped resources and politics. Superpowers competed for global influence through aid. Medical supplies and expertise became tools of diplomacy. The Soviet Union provided vaccine and funds to international campaigns. The United States supplied technical teams and money through its agencies. Those rivalries created a strange alliance on the smallpox front. Public health became an area where cooperation could survive political tension. The telegram reached the National Ministry. Officials tallied cases and checked stockpiles. They sent a cable to the regional WHO office. The WHO desk sent a request to Geneva. Geneva sent a directive to vaccine-producing laboratories. Laboratories allocated doses from existing contracts. Air transport was arranged through military charters and civilian carriers. A single crate moved from freezer to aircraft to truck. It crossed a border under diplomatic clearance. It arrived at a field hospital in the afternoon. Logistics alone did not solve the problem. Someone still had to decide how to use the stock. In some places, mass campaigns vaccinated everyone in a town. In other places, teams tracked cases and targeted contacts. Those decisions were technical and political. Field officers balanced vaccine supplies against personnel shortages. They negotiated with local leaders for access to camps. They explained safety to terrified mothers and suspicious elders. 1967. The World Health Organization launched the intensified smallpox eradication program. Leadership changed the game. Donald A. Henderson led the effort from WHO headquarters. He brought epidemiology, logistics, and administrative rigor together. The program had a clear mandate and a budget. That combination made a global campaign operationally possible. Before 1967, smallpox eradication existed as an idea. After 1967, it became a plan with teams and timelines. Henderson insisted on accountability. Countries had to report cases and accept assistance. WHO field units were embedded in national programs. The program turned fragmented national efforts into a coordinated campaign. It also insisted on flexibility. Where mass vaccination failed to stop transmission, teams switched tactics. They cut off spread with surveillance and containment. They hunted individual cases like detectives following a trail. A clear line of command mattered in emergencies. When armies moved and refugees fled, decisions had to be fast. Supply routes had to be rerouted. Staff had to be reassigned. Those were the same kinds of decisions made in wartime. Wartime experience taught speed, triage, and improvisation. Those practices translated directly into smallpox work. Field epidemiologists became the new frontline soldiers. They learned to read patterns on maps and in registries. They followed infection chains from village to river to market. They organised ring vaccinations around confirmed cases. They coordinated with military engineers to reach isolated settlements. They used radio and telephone networks built for armies. Those communications networks cut response times dramatically. International funding finally matched ambition. Philanthropic foundations had been supporting public health for decades. Now governments put serious money behind eradication. WHO budgets expanded. Agencies like the Centers for Disease Control sent hundreds of experts. National laboratories prioritised smallpox vaccine production. Field supplies multiplied. Vaccination campaigns flickered from district to district like relief convoys. The process was not smooth or romantic. Political resistance sometimes slowed access to vulnerable populations. Bureaucracies fought over authority and credit. Cold weather and monsoons ruined stock in poorly insulated storage. A single delay could allow an outbreak to explode. Field workers risked disease and violence to reach people. They worked in refugee camps, on riverbanks and at front lines. Their daily success was often invisible to capital cities. Still, progress accumulated like stacked bricks. A healed child in one village reduced risk for villages downriver. Vaccinated cohorts created pockets of immunity. Those pockets grew into barriers against spread. The campaign did not eliminate smallpox in a single sweep. It advanced in waves, retreating from some areas, converging in others. The machinery built out of war, empire, and diplomacy pushed that advance forward. There were decisive moments that tested the system. When borders closed during regional conflicts, WHO negotiated temporary corridors. When vaccine stocks were low, generous donors filled the gap. When a last case appeared, teams surrounded the household until transmission stopped. Those moments revealed the strength of the networks. They also revealed human cost and courage. By the late 1960s and early 1970s, stories multiplied. A plane delivered vaccine to a rainy airstrip in West Africa. A district nurse in South Asia vaccinated an entire refugee camp in a night. A laboratory in Europe shipped freeze-dried vaccine across the equator. Each story connected the laboratory bench to the bedside. They showed how bureaucratic decisions rippled into human lives. The campaign also changed what public health could be. It proved that a coordinated international effort could eradicate a disease. It proved that national sovereignty and global coordination could coexist. It taught new norms for surveillance, reporting, and rapid response. Those norms shaped later global health efforts. Smallpox eradication became the template for campaigns against other diseases. The payoff was quiet and monumental. Local telegrams like that first one became unnecessary as cases fell. Vaccines still moved, but for routine immunization rather than emergency rescue. The networks built for wartime and empire had been repurposed for life. They carried not bullets and rations, but protection and hope. In the end, eradication demanded institutions larger than any one nation. It demanded the ships, the planes, the laboratories, and the trained hands. Those were the tools war and empire had left behind. Diplomacy and politics provided the fuel to run them. The WHO provided the map and the authority to use them. The telegram that began this chapter became obsolete. No one would need to send that urgently again. The machinery it activated had done its work. Battlefields had turned into vaccination sites. Borders had been reimagined as channels for aid. That is the paradox at the heart of global health. The instruments of conflict and domination also built the way out. Victory over smallpox relied on those instruments and on people willing to use them for good. The networks of war and empire became the scaffolding of a new international health order. The campaign would still face its last stubborn fights. But without the wartime science and the institutional scaffolding that emerged after the Second World War, eradication would never have been imaginable. The global solution arrived aboard military transports, through colonial clinics, and under the authority of a new World Health Organization. It arrived because a telegram could set a global machine in motion. Case number 423 traced to Village X. Begin containment immediately. A logbook like that was the program's daily map. A simple line could trigger a chain of travel orders. A single entry could rewire supplies for an entire district. These entries were the working language of eradication teams. By the late 1960s, the World Health Organization had a new goal. The campaign shifted from mass vaccination to careful detective work. The answer was surveillance containment. Find the case, isolate it, immunize the people who touched it. Surveillance containment rejected the fantasy of vaccinating everyone at once. It accepted a harder truth instead. Viruses spread along human routes and human routines. If those routes were interrupted, transmission stalled. Ring vaccination became the technique of choice. It meant vaccinating contacts of a case and contacts of those contacts. It created layers of immunity around a known infection. That ring could stop the virus without vaccinating an entire nation. This approach was not academic. It was born in the field where vaccine supplies were scarce. A young CDC doctor, William Fuge, turned it into practice in Nigeria. He and local teams tracked households, built lists, and moved fast. One case produced dozens of questions. Who slept in the same room? Who butchered an animal? Who sold goods in the market? Teams turned questions into checklists and checklists into focused vaccination drives. They used minimal doses and stopped chains of infection. The shift mattered because supply lines still defined success. Vaccine vials travelled long distances in hot weather. Cold chains were fragile. Road convoys were slow. Rivers and deserts interrupted plans. Every dose that survived the journey counted. Technological fixes changed the calculus on those roads. Freeze-dried vaccine arrived as a game-changer. Lyophilized vaccine could travel longer without refrigeration. Field workers simply reconstituted it with sterile diluent before use. The freeze-dried vaccine cut waste and loss in half or more. It meant vaccine would still work after long bumpy drives. It meant one less variable between a team and a successful containment. It allowed managers to send vaccine deeper into the field. A second humble invention increased throughput. The bifurcated needle came from industry. It was a small metal fork that held a tiny drop of vaccine. That tiny drop, applied with 5 quick punctures, created a reliable take. The bifurcated needle required less vaccine per person. It was quick to teach and quick to use. Teams vaccinated hundreds of people per day with a single needle. They could sterilize it and reuse it safely in the field. Together, these tools changed field math. A team could now carry fewer vials and vaccinate more people. They could travel further and respond faster to a logbook entry. They could convert surveillance information into immediate action. Operational systems were simple and relentless. Surveillance officers kept daily logs and maps. Searchers visited markets, houses, and clinics every morning. They reported suspected cases back to district centres by radio or motorcycle. A suspected case triggered a cascade. Laboratory confirmation arrived if possible. A contact list was drawn up. A vaccination team was dispatched. Teams were modular and mobile. A typical ring team included a vaccinator, a recorder, and a local guide. They carried a small cooler, vaccine vials, diluent, and the bifurcated needle. They brought notebooks and a stash of sweets to win children's cooperation. Maps mattered like never before. Dots on paper became hot spots to be ringed and sealed. When clusters moved toward highways or river crossings, response priorities shifted. Resources followed the lines of human movement. The program also leaned on local knowledge. Village elders knew who had family across borders. Market traders knew which buses carried itinerant labourers. Neighbourhood watchfulness turned into an intelligence network. The strategy saved both time and money. Instead of vaccinating whole provinces, teams focused doses where they were needed. Vaccines stretched farther, and resources were reallocated to surveillance. That reallocation accelerated eradication timelines across continents. Not all outbreaks yielded easily. Conflict zones slowed teams. Nomadic populations slipped between surveillance nets. Mistrust sometimes kept people from reporting classic lesions. In those situations, improvisation mattered. Health workers negotiated safe passage with local leaders. They trained village volunteers to report and vaccinate in their absence. They used mobile clinics and midday markets to reach drifting populations. Coordination across agencies was another invisible feat. WHO coordinated donations, manufacturing and distribution. National governments provided local staff, transport and security. Non-governmental groups supplied vehicles and sometimes language skills. Vaccine supply chains were tightened with central planning. Regional cold stores held reserves ready for rapid dispatch. Manufacturers filled orders in larger, more stable batches. Donations and purchases were matched to surveillance intelligence. Record-keeping allowed the program to learn quickly. Weekly reports revealed trends and blind spots. When a village reappeared on multiple logs, teams went back with more resources. When contacts failed to appear, surveillance doubled down. The detective work extended to airports and border crossings. Travel histories became prime data points. Every passenger manifest could be a new line in a logbook. Customs and airline staff often became ad hoc sentinels. Two faces of leadership steered the shift. D.A. Henderson led the World Health Organization's global effort. William Foge provided the operational blueprint from field experience. Their combination turned policy into replicable action. Field methods were tested repeatedly in diverse environments. In India, teams adapted mass campaigns to ring tactics. Remote districts used searchers who walked for days between settlements. In West Africa, riverboats served as mobile vaccination platforms. Success was incremental and cumulative. One correctly handled case prevented dozens of secondary infections. One functional cold box saved entire village campaigns. One trained searcher found the index case before it seeded another town. The work demanded discipline under pressure. A missed record could undo months of effort. A single exhausted vaccinator could allow a cluster to grow unnoticed. Field supervisors monitored both data and morale. Slow, careful acts added up to decisive results. By combining surveillance and containment, countries shortened outbreak durations. By improving vaccine stability and delivery, teams increased success rates. By mapping human movement, programs outpaced viral movement. When the last outbreaks came in the late 1970s, these systems mattered most. They converted a global strategy into local action. They proved a stubborn idea in epidemiology. The map and the needle together beat the microbe. 1967. 1 year, one program pivot, one global redirection. That moment made eradication not only possible but practical. It turned medical knowledge into operational reality in dusty villages and crowded clinics. In the end, smallpox fell to process as much as to biology. Labour, logistics and discipline detection closed the final gaps. A logbook entry in a dusty office still started the chain that finished the virus. The victory belonged to surveillance, to focused vaccination rings, and to those who carried them out. Containment was quiet work. It looked like lists, coolers, maps, and repetition. It looked like reinvention under pressure. It looked in the end like the last case being found and ringed. Eradication was won not by a single moment of genius. It was won by thousands of procedural decisions executed reliably over years. The virus met a system that hunted every case and closed every ring. That system was the decisive instrument of victory. Headlights cut through the night like a searchlight in a theatre. A white van idled on the road outside a cluster of mud houses. A nurse checked a battered list under the dashboard light. Names were crossed. Names were added. Names were circled. She tucked the list into her pocket and picked up a two-pronged needle. The vaccine was already warm from the cooler beside her. She had been awake since before sunset. Every minute mattered. A child might have had a fever yesterday. A neighbour might have reported a rash. They were hunting a chain, door by door, house by house. The team moved like thieves in the night, not to steal, to save. The first door opened on a sleeping family. A woman squinted at the beam of light. A tiny boy clung to her shoulder. The nurse crouched and showed the boy the tiny scar she would make. The mother gripped her hand and then relaxed. In 1974 and 1975, these night raids were routine across India. The government and the World Health Organization mobilized teams by the thousands. They ran vaccination booths and they mounted door-to-door drives. They moved along migration routes, markets and rivers. They chased rumours and they followed every fever report. Mass campaigns vaccinated whole neighbourhoods in a single sweep. They used local clinics and temple halls as weekend vaccination centres. They learned to speak the local tongue to calm frightened families. They bargained with shopkeepers for safe storage of vaccine in cool wells. They slept on classroom floors between rounds. The scale was enormous and the work was relentless. India's massive campaigns in 1974 and 1975 changed the map. Millions of arms received the tiny prick. Communities that had endured smallpox for generations went months without a case. But it was not only numbers that mattered. Tactics changed because people in the field changed them. When mass vaccination hit walls of distrust, teams adapted. They shifted from blanket coverage to focused searches. They tied vaccination to listening. They learned to trust village leaders and local healers. One nurse's simple hand on a child's shoulder convinced a sceptical father to let his son be vaccinated. That trust saved lives. Half a world away, in dusty towns of West Africa, a different kind of hunt was unfolding. There the vaccine supply and the number of vaccinators were limited. A rigid mass campaign would have been impossible to sustain. Dr. William H. Fuge faced the problem in hard, practical terms. He saw that chasing every fever was a waste if the real cases could be found and isolated. He and his teams developed a sharper method. Find a case. Find its contacts. Vaccinate the circle around it. This became known as ring vaccination. It relied on rapid intelligence rather than broad saturation. Local informants were the programme's eyes. Market sellers, postal workers, school teachers reported suspicious rashes. A village barber's memory of a rash was as valuable as a lab report. Teams rode motorcycles and bicycles across red tracks to reach those reports. They used simple coolers and improvised ice packs to keep vaccine viable. They slept in hammocks and negotiated food from villagers. In one slow, grainy photograph, Dr. Foge crouches beside a small boy receiving vaccine. Stories from those months read like detective novels of public health. Names were followed from house to house. A grandmother's memory of a cousin's cough led to a ring that covered 3 hamlets. A trader's route became a path for vaccinators to follow at dawn. These were not glamorous innovations. They were clever, necessary, and brutal in their simplicity. In parts of West Africa, surveillance and containment worked where mass campaigns could not. They broke chains that otherwise would have continued for months. They taught the eradication effort a vital lesson. The disease could be defeated not only by numbers, but by information and speed. In 1977, the program faced its final test. A cluster appeared in Somalia that autumn. The news carried a special kind of weight now. There had already been quiet months in many countries. If this outbreak spread, the end would be delayed. If the teams failed, smallpox would remain a world problem. They moved faster than before. Roads were blocked and clinics emptied their benches. Medical trucks converged on the port towns. They traced contacts back through markets and mosques. They found a patient whose rash matched the textbook description. He had been admitted to a local hospital with a fever and lesions. Healthcare workers recognised the pattern. The teams isolated the ward. They mapped everyone the patient had met in the previous weeks. They vaccinated his immediate family and everyone in the adjacent huts. He was the last case that arose in nature. Ali Malin, 1977. He recovered. The search continued. They found no linked cases. The surveillance nets held. The international program filed the report and the world edged closer to its historic goal. Then, almost a year later, a very different scare reached the papers. Smallpox had appeared not in a village, but inside a British medical school. A woman who worked in the building developed a fever and a vesicular rash. The infection traced back to a laboratory, where variola virus samples were studied. One life was lost. Janet Parker, 1978. Her death forced a hard conversation. If natural transmission had ended, laboratory risks had not vanished. Public health officials had to rethink containment and safety. Hospitals tightened isolation rules. Laboratories rewrote protocols for handling and storing the virus. The incident did not undo eradication. It illuminated a new danger. It also underlined the human cost inside the last months of the fight. Teams on the front lines continued their work even in the face of personal risk. They crossed political boundaries and linguistic divides. They slept in cars and on floors. They argued with local leaders and with sceptical relatives. They negotiated with police to keep roads open. They carried vaccines in coolers on the backs of donkeys. They recruited schoolteachers and midwives as spotters. They learned to respect local customs and to adapt strategies accordingly. When a case appeared on the outskirts of a crowded city, the decision was never simple. Should vaccinators sweep the district, or should they trace and quarantine contacts? Time and place decided the method. A quick local ring could save scarce vaccine in one province. A mass campaign could blunt a city outbreak in the next. Field leaders made those calls. Their choices were tactical and often improvisational. Many decisions had moral weight. When teams vaccinated a whole neighbourhood, they sometimes interrupted livelihoods. When they quarantined families, they disrupted food supplies. Local leaders balanced health and survival. Success required negotiation as much as technique. The final weeks boiled down to thousands of small victories. A village that accepted vaccination because a respected elder agreed. A market vendor who reported a rash despite fearing lost customers. A nurse who refused to stop looking until a missing child was found and vaccinated. These acts added up. They stopped transmission one chain at a time. They were not often recorded in glossy headlines. They were recorded in logbooks, in returned signatures, and in 1,000 tiny scars. When the World Health Organization declared victory years later, the proclamation rested on field reports. The victory belonged first to the people who carried vaccine from town to town. It belonged to those who negotiated a path into reluctant homes. It belonged to the epidemiologists who mapped chains and the drivers who crossed flooded tracks. It belonged to the local leaders who vouched for strangers at midnight. It belonged to the families who accepted a prick that gave their children a chance at life. The end of endemic smallpox did not erase pain and loss. It honoured too many lives taken by a single virus. But the methods that finished the job were built on real conversations and hard choices. They were built on the willingness to adapt when plans failed. They were built on listening to communities and making local realities the centre of strategy. In the final reckoning, eradication became less a technical achievement than a human one. People on the ground turned global strategy into action that reached one household at a time. They worked in the dark and in the heat and in the long, quiet hours of surveillance. They bore risk and found ways to reduce it. They placed vaccine between a child and a lifelong scar. They made the last chains of transmission impossible to sustain. Their work closed the circle on centuries of suffering. The story of the last outbreaks is a story of persistence, creativity, and courage. It is a story that belongs to nurses in vans, to epidemiologists on motorcycles, to village elders, and to nameless vaccinators. Eradication was not a single event. It was 1,000 moments of right choice under pressure. Those moments changed history. 2 laboratories hold the last samples of smallpox. One sits beneath towering security at the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention in Atlanta. The other sits inside a guarded complex at the State Research Center Vector near Novosibirsk. Between them, freezers keep a virus that once reshaped continents. After the World Health Organization declared smallpox eradicated in 1980, a new argument began. It was an argument over the meaning of finality. Should humanity destroy the last physical remnants of smallpox, or should those remnants be preserved for science and for safety? The debate unfolded slowly. It moved through committees, conferences, and closed-door briefings. It pulled epidemiologists, diplomats, soldiers, and ethicists into the same room. It forced the question, what is acceptable risk when facing a threat eliminated from nature? The case for destruction was simple to say. If no living human carries smallpox, then the virus has no function in the world. Destroy the samples, and the last routes to infection close. Destroy the material and the moral stain of smallpox could be buried with the disease. Destroy it, and the risk of accidental release disappears, some argued. Destroy it and the chance of theft or weaponization shrinks. For survivors and descendants of victims, destruction carried a kind of justice. The case for preservation was also brisk and real. Scientists warned that new surprises lay hidden in the virus's biology. They said preserved samples could reveal vulnerabilities for better vaccines. They said research could produce antiviral drugs as a last resort defense. They said improved diagnostics might let authorities detect deliberate releases faster. They warned that destroying the samples would end possibilities for understanding variola fully. Those who fought for preservation spoke with the language of preparedness. Those voices included leaders of the eradication campaign. Donald A. Henderson, who had led the WHO effort, feared haste. He framed preservation as prudent. He argued that science still had unanswered questions. Other prominent scientists agreed. They proposed strict limits on access to the virus for approved research only. They proposed international oversight to reduce misuse. But memories of laboratory accidents cut through those proposals. In 1978, an accidental release in Birmingham killed a laboratory photographer named Janet Parker. Her death was a sharp reminder that containment could fail. That incident had closed labs and tightened rules. It also convinced many people that the safest course was elimination of the material itself. Geopolitics pressed the debate even harder. At the Cold War's height, both superpowers explored biological weapons programs. By the 1990s, evidence surfaced that the Soviet program had been larger and more secretive than publicly known. That revelation undermined trust in any hands that claimed to control the virus. If one state could deceive the world about offensive programs, then who could guarantee long-term stewardship? For many nations, control meant power. Whoever kept the samples controlled knowledge and leverage. The World Health Organization sat at the center of the dispute. WHO had certified eradication and inherited responsibility for the virus's fate. The agency convened advisory committees repeatedly through the 1990s and into the 2000s. Those panels balanced scientific reports against political realities. They asked each time whether retained research justified continued risk. They set conditions for any retained work. They demanded periodic review. They delayed a final decision again and again. Those delays mattered. They gave researchers time to sequence and study the virus more deeply. They produced concrete benefits. New diagnostic tests became more sensitive. Laboratories learned how to detect variola genetic signatures quickly. Vaccinology advanced too. Safer vaccine strains and production techniques improved. Antiviral candidates moved from theory toward practical testing. These gains strengthened arguments for retention. They also hardened opponents' resolve. Every new experiment reopened the wound of why the virus had once killed so many. The debate also forced practical work on containment and security. Laboratories holding variola upgraded physical protections. They tightened personnel vetting and record-keeping. International inspectors observed operations more often. The episode helped define modern biosecurity norms. Those norms later informed responses to other pathogens. They shaped laboratory accreditation and biosafety levels worldwide. Public sentiment weighed on the decision too. Families of smallpox victims often wanted the collection destroyed. Survivors who bore scars carried a visceral sense of indignation toward any conservation. For them, samples in freezers felt like trophies rather than tools. Politicians could not ignore that language of justice. Yet realpolitik persisted. The United States and Russia, as custodians, had outsized influence. Their mutual distrust complicated treaty-style solutions. Each feared that relinquishing the virus would put it beyond their own ability to defend citizens. Each feared that destruction might not be verified or might be faked. Those suspicions turned what might have been a straightforward scientific choice into a geopolitical standoff. Inspection, verification, and transparency became bargaining chips. WHO insisted on access and clear reporting. Russia and the United States negotiated terms for continued storage and research. The worldwide community watched for any sign of an agreement or a breach. When the Soviet Union collapsed, newly released information intensified unease. Former Soviet scientists' memoirs described programs that included weaponized smallpox. That history made promises of future transparency harder to accept at face value. Time passed, and positions hardened. The 1990s brought repeated votes and resolutions at WHO. The organization approved only limited research programs. It demanded strict protocols and periodic review. It set deadlines for reporting results that might justify further attention. But those deadlines slipped. Each new study argued that more information might yet be gained. By the 2000s, a clearer scientific picture had emerged. Genetic sequencing of variola illuminated its vulnerabilities. Researchers identified potential drug targets. They mapped the virus's relationship to other poxviruses. Those discoveries reduced some uncertainty. They also exposed how little margin remained for error. The moral question sharpened alongside the science. Was it morally acceptable to keep a pathogen that had killed millions? Or was it morally acceptable to risk losing knowledge that could save future lives? Ethicists debated the balance between the rights of the dead and the protections of the living. There were no easy answers. The decision had practical consequences for how humanity handles dangerous pathogens. It set precedent for the retention of other eradicated or near-eradicated agents. It shaped rules around who may hold what and under what oversight. It pushed states to invest in laboratory security. It pushed international institutions to build verification mechanisms. When the question reached moments of public drama, voices on both sides sounded stark. Experts warned of catastrophic consequences if variola escaped the lab. Others warned that destroying samples would leave humanity blind to rare possibilities. Those alarms changed funding priorities. They shifted research toward countermeasures that could be deployed quickly. In private meetings, delegates weighed not only scientific data, but trust. They asked whether a treaty could ensure compliance. They asked whether inspections would be thorough or merely symbolic. They feared clandestine programs under weak regulatory systems. Trust, they concluded, was itself a technical instrument. Without it, no agreement could be verified with confidence. The stalemate persisted until a pragmatic compromise took shape. 2 laboratories retained the official, fully infectious virus. Other nations agreed to limit research to non-infectious materials when possible. WHO required regular reporting and external review. The world accepted a form of imperfect stewardship. It was stewardship grounded in caution rather than closure. That compromise left lingering unease. It satisfied neither the absolutists who demanded destruction, nor the absolutists who demanded permanent preservation. It reflected practical politics. It reflected the limits of international law applied to biological risk. It reflected the human uncertainty about whether we can hold dangerous things forever without losing them. The final chapters of Smallpox' story did not occur in laboratories alone. They played out in parlours and courts, in government ministries, and in the pages of scientific journals. They happened where fear met hope, and where national rivalry met collective necessity. Because the stakes were not merely academic, the decisions carried real weight. Today, the image endures. 2 freezers in distant places holding the last remnant of an ancient killer. That image is compact, almost biblical. It also obscures the messy negotiations behind it. Those negotiations taught painful lessons about risk. They taught about the limits of technological control. They taught about the cost of mistrust between nations. In the end, the choice to keep those last samples remained a moral and geopolitical calculation. It balanced the possible benefits of future science against the real danger of present risk. It balanced the desire to honour victims with the desire to protect future generations. Those balances shifted, and they will shift again. The smallpox debate forced humanity to confront what it means to control knowledge. 2 laboratories still stand. They keep the virus under watch because the world asked them to. The choice to preserve was not a purely scientific decision. It was a choice about who should hold power over life and death. It was a test of trust between nations. It was a test of whether institutions can manage the most dangerous tools in human hands. The legacy of that debate is tangible. It shaped modern biosecurity. It shaped the architecture of global health governance. It shaped how the world thinks about destruction, preservation, and the ethics between them. The freezers are quiet now, but the question they embody remains active. Destroy them, and you close a painful chapter. Keep them, and you keep a slim hope for answers yet to come. There is no neutral ground between those choices. There is only judgment, responsibility, and the slow work of trust. A simulated smallpox release in a Washington suburb. The words sat at the top of a declassified briefing paper. The scenario called for a crowded commuter rail at 8:45. It imagined a single infected person spreading virus to dozens in an hour. By day 3, hospitals would be overwhelmed. By day 10, the nation would be scrambling vaccines and law. The exercise had a name: Dark Winter. It took place in late summer of 2001. It was meant to expose holes in planning, supplies and will. Participants left shaken. They had played at national collapse. That simulated panic still echoes through policy today. Dark Winter was not the start of Cold War fears about biological weapons. Those fears began decades earlier. In 1969, President Richard Nixon made a public break with past practice. He ordered the United States to end offensive biological weapons work. The laboratories closed. Official programs switched to defense and detection. That decision led directly to an international treaty. In 1972, states signed the Biological Weapons Convention. It banned development and possession of biological weapons. It promised a new era of restraint. That promise proved fragile. Across the Iron Curtain, the Soviet Union agreed on paper. Behind its walls, a massive program continued in secret. Biopreparat became the cloak for an industrial-scale biological weapons effort. It built factories and recruited scientists. It had numbers, facilities and budgets unmatched anywhere else. Defectors in the early 90s revealed what quiet intelligence had missed. One former Soviet biologist named Kanatjan Alibekov spoke publicly. He described a system that weaponized smallpox. He named laboratories and production goals. He said the program had produced enough virus to be militarily useful. Western officials treated his claims with urgency and caution. Some details later proved true. Other claims could not be fully verified. Those revelations changed the meaning of eradication. The World Health Organization declared smallpox eradicated in 1980. The last naturally occurring case had appeared in 1977. Smallpox no longer circulated among people. Yet eradication did not erase technical knowledge. It did not remove the laboratories that possessed strains. It did not end the appetite some states had for biological weapons. The Soviet program taught a stark lesson. Legal bans do not stop determined programs. Economic collapse and political secrecy can hide a vast effort. Scientists who had fought smallpox for public health could be recruited into military projects. The lines between defence and offence blurred. A more painful lesson landed in 1978 in England. A laboratory in Birmingham handled smallpox for research. An infection escaped. One person died. The incident forced a reckoning about lab safety. It also showed how fragile control could be, even in peacetime. Cold War strategy elevated smallpox beyond a medical scourge. Its properties made it attractive militarily. It spread easily before lesions appeared. It caused severe illness and death. Populations lacked immunity after decades of halted routine vaccination. A single release could overwhelm an unprepared society. Military planners thought in equations. Casualty projections became leverage in Cold War bargaining. Smallpox entered wargaming and contingency plans. That militarization reshaped public health priorities. Vaccines moved from clinics to bunkers. Research budgets followed defense lines. In the United States, defense thinking produced stockpiles and research. The Centers for Disease Control kept the world's official smallpox repository. The Soviet Union maintained its own facility in Koltsovo. These kept live virus for stated defensive research. They also offered temptation for misuse. Scientists involved in these programs later described moral conflict. A prominent virologist would say his work haunted him. A retired intelligence analyst admitted to underestimating the Soviet scope. A WHO official remembered sleepless nights over whether to recommend destroying stocks. Each confession was short and plain. Each confession carried weight. The debate over what to do with remaining stocks began almost immediately. Some argued for destruction to remove any hope of weaponization. Others argued to keep stocks for research into diagnostics, antivirals, and safer vaccines. The first major vote took place in the 80s. The World Health Assembly considered destruction in 1986. It deferred action. Scientists argued for continued study. National security officials argued for retention. Then geopolitics intervened. The Soviet collapse in 1991 peeled back layers of secrecy. Defectors and audits revealed biopreparat's scale. Western governments suddenly faced a harsher reality. If the Soviet Union had secretly weaponized smallpox, then legal eradication was incomplete protection. The possibility of clandestine stockpiles changed the policy calculus. Policymakers reacted in two directions. They pursued stronger international norms and verification measures. They also invested heavily in domestic biodefense. Laboratories increased surveillance. Stockpiles of vaccines and antiviral drugs grew. Emergency plans multiplied. Hospitals ran exercises. Public health agencies rehearsed mass vaccination logistics. Those investments followed hard events. Dark winter in 2001 highlighted weaknesses. Soon after, a biological attack using mailed anthrax letters terrified the United States. The anthrax letters proved that small-scale attacks could paralyze institutions. They also accelerated funding for biodefense across government. Contracts poured into pharmaceutical firms. New vaccines were developed. New labs were built. The policy changes had costs and consequences. Large stockpiles required storage, testing, and renewal. Vaccination carries risk, with adverse events in some recipients. Deciding who to vaccinate became a political and ethical problem. Military personnel and first responders received priority. Civilians did not unless an attack occurred. These choices reflected trade-offs between readiness and safety. The scientific community also faced difficult choices. Publishing methods for working with dangerous pathogens risks misuse. Open science supports rapid response. But openness also hands tools to bad actors. Journals and institutions instituted review processes. Some experiments were held back or modified. These policies created tension between transparency and security. International law remained imperfect. The Biological Weapons Convention lacked robust verification mechanisms. States could sign and violate quietly. Negotiations to improve verification failed repeatedly. This institutional weakness perpetuated mistrust. Trust between states did not return to Cold War levels. As technology advanced, new threats emerged. Synthetic biology made creating and modifying viruses easier. Genome sequences of variola are publicly available. Laboratory synthesis became plausible for well-funded actors. That reality changed the calculus again. Eradication of natural disease no longer guaranteed safety from engineered threats. The moral unease deepened with every revelation. A former Soviet scientist later described routine lies to family about work. A Western biosecurity official confessed to nights spent imagining worst-case scenarios. A WHO veteran admitted being paralyzed by the question of whether to destroy the last samples. These small confessions form a chorus of responsibility and regret. Two defining moments deserve slower telling. 1. 1969. President Nixon announced the end of offensive biological weapons programs. That day set a norm that changed policy worldwide. It moved resources into detection, vaccine safety, and public health laboratories. It also underlined how political decisions reshape scientific priorities. 2. The 1990s revelations. Soviet program details emerged. The world learned that eradication had not erased political appetite for biological tools. The disclosures forced a rethinking of treaties, verification, and national preparedness. They drove investments that changed public health infrastructure forever. In the end, smallpox taught two lessons at once. Eradication proved that coordinated public health work can remove a global threat. Cold War nightmares proved that political will can resurrect the same threat for darker ends. The paradox shaped the new field of biosecurity. Today, live variola remains in two known repositories. Public documents and museum archives keep the historical record alive. National stockpiles, detection networks, and legal norms work to prevent deliberate use. But the spectre of misuse is never far. Every advance in biology sharpens both the promise of cures and the risk of harm. The story does not end in a single file cabinet or a single vote. It unfolds in laboratories, in diplomatic halls, in emergency rooms, and in exercises with awkward names. It rests on routines that must be practiced. It depends on trust between nations that is hard to rebuild. Smallpox no longer kills as it once did. Its legacy, however, reaches into the heart of modern security. Cold War nightmares taught that diseases can be weapons. They also taught how fragile the boundaries between medicine and militarism can be. The final victory over smallpox must be measured by more than the absence of cases. It must be judged by the systems built to prevent its return. Those systems are political, scientific, and moral. They require persistent vigilance. In the quiet rooms where policy is made, the question persists. How much safety is worth the cost of liberty and risk to individuals? How much secrecy is needed to deter misuse? How much openness is necessary to prepare for the next crisis? The answers will never be perfect. History shows trade-offs and unexpected consequences. Smallpox's eradication removed a routine global risk. The Cold War showed how easily that removal could be undone. The dead are gone. The fear remains, sharpened by human choices. That is why the world continues to watch, to stockpile, to legislate, and to argue. Smallpox's final victory taught a clear lesson. Humanity can defeat a disease together, but politics can turn medicine into a weapon. Keeping the victory requires constant, uneasy work. A woman lifts a child's sleeve and steadies a small arm gently. A tiny prickle. The child blinks and goes back to scribbling with crayons. The nurse's hands are steady from years of travel and long nights. A battered ledger sits open on the clinic table, full of names. A brass plaque above the sink catches the morning light and reads, aloud, Smallpox, eradicated 1980. The plaque is more than metal. It is a promise kept. On May 8th, 1980, the World Health Assembly declared smallpox eradicated. That sentence changed how governments imagined what public health could accomplish together. It proved coordinated international action could do what national programs alone could not. The last widely recognized wild case had appeared in Somalia in 1977. A separate laboratory accident in Birmingham in 1978 sharpened global anxieties. Both episodes taught an ugly lesson about complacency and the fragility of success. In the clinic, Amina closes the ledger and explains vaccination to a young mother. Amina is one of many who carried the fight across villages and borders. She began as a door-to-door vaccinator during the intensified WHO campaign in 1967. She learned to read faces, maps, and the patterns of daily life. She remembers searches at dawn, teams knocking at secluded doors, and long drives. She remembers names scratched into notebooks that later became official records of elimination. Those notebooks became templates for surveillance systems around the world. The eradication effort prevented millions of deaths and relieved tremendous long-term burdens on health systems. Hospitals freed beds and staff. Immunization programs expanded beyond smallpox to childhood diseases. Money once spent forever chasing epidemics could be invested in maternal care and nutrition. Perhaps most important, eradication left a practical method the world could borrow. That method had three core elements: active surveillance, local partnerships, and targeted vaccination. Surveillance meant hunting the disease instead of waiting for it to announce itself. Teams mapped movements, traced contacts, and recorded every suspicious rash and fever. Local partnerships turned distrust into access when elders and teachers led the way. Targeted vaccination, often called ring vaccination, closed circles around detected cases. A small bifurcated needle multiplied limited vaccine supplies and sped delivery dramatically. Freeze-drying vaccines and portable cold boxes kept doses viable in harsh climates. These technical fixes mattered because logistics and timing decided each outbreak's fate. The WHO campaign taught nimbleness, adapt to terrain, language, politics, and cultural practice. Field teams negotiated entry with imams, village chiefs, and midwives. Anthropologists advised how to speak about disease without provoking fear or resistance. In some places, mandatory programs sparked riots. In many other places, trust solved the problem. That lesson became plain during mass campaigns and during careful containment operations. It was not science alone that ended smallpox. It was science married to trust. The campaign also rewrote how nations cooperate during crises. Rival states, including Cold War adversaries, shared vaccine, expertise, and funds. Diplomacy bent toward public health, and unexpected partnerships formed at local levels. Donald A. Henderson and his colleagues at WHO coordinated many of those global efforts. Their doctrine prioritised rapid detection, immediate containment, and ruthless follow-through. Those tactics informed the Global Polio Eradication Initiative launched in 1988. Polio programs borrowed the surveillance architecture and mobilised millions for vaccination days. Measles control efforts also adopted case-finding and outbreak response techniques from smallpox. But the blueprint had limits and revealed a caution. Smallpox had no animal reservoir and produced unmistakable symptoms. Those traits made eradication possible. Other pathogens behave differently, and eradication is not always feasible or wise. Polio transmits silently in many infected people, making it much harder to find. HIV, influenza, and coronaviruses pose distinct challenges that demand different strategies. Still, the principles of surveillance, community engagement, and focused response remain invaluable. Modern pandemic responses owe a debt to the organisational lessons learned during eradication. Rapid testing, contact tracing, transparent reporting, and local engagement echo the smallpox model. But the model also warns against heavy-handed measures that alienate the very communities programs must reach. Amina's ledger is a daily reminder that public health is practiced face-to-face. She trains new vaccinators to listen first, speak second, and never promise what they cannot deliver. Those small practices prevented resistance and allowed teams to move across suspicious neighbourhoods. They also safeguarded the informal networks that supplied intelligence about where new cases might appear. The campaign's human cost was real. Teams worked in danger zones with minimal comforts. Some workers fell ill. Some faced hostility and even violence during tense moments. Those sacrifices were woven into the moral fabric of the global program. Eradication offered a rare victory, but it also left unresolved responsibilities. Governments and scientists wrestled with the fate of remaining virus stocks after eradication. 2 official repositories continued to hold live variola virus under strict security. Scientists argued to retain samples for research into antivirals, improved vaccines and diagnostics. Others argued for their immediate destruction to remove any risk of accidental or malicious release. That debate stretched into the next decades, exposing tensions between research and safety. The Birmingham laboratory death in 1978 crystallized those fears for many people. It reminded the world that viruses do not respect institutional fences or neat timelines. In the years following eradication, scientists developed better diagnostics and emergency vaccines. Research into antiviral drugs and improved laboratory containment accelerated under new pressures. Tecovirimat and other treatments emerged decades later, in part because of that sustained focus. Those medical advances offer reassurance, but they do not erase the danger of neglect. Eradication also created practical new obligations for global health governance. Surveillance had to remain active to ensure that absence did not become amnesia. International norms about data sharing, laboratory safety, and outbreak notification grew out of that work. The WHO acquired tools and credibility it would later deploy in other crises. The people trained in the smallpox campaign became frontline leaders in other emergencies. Their experience mattered in vaccination drives, outbreak investigations, and health system strengthening. Still, every new challenge demanded fresh study and fresh humility. Smallpox's absence opened policy questions about equity and priorities that persist today. Which diseases deserve eradication attempts? What costs are nations willing to bear? How should global institutions balance sovereignty with collective security during outbreaks? Those debates are not academic. They determine how resources are spent and who receives help. Amina faces those questions in miniature every week at her clinic. She explains why a child needs routine doses and records names faithfully. She corrects myths about vaccines and seeks leaders who will vouch for her teams. Her steady work makes public health an ongoing civic commitment rather than an occasional campaign. For survivors, the eradication plaque is both relief and charge. It honours those who died, recognises those who fought, and warns against forgetting crucial lessons. In one archive story, the last naturally occurring case in Somalia became a public health worker later. That life arc illustrates how a community can move from victimhood to stewardship. The full victory, then, was not just biological, it was civic and moral as well. Smallpox no longer scars faces, but its absence demands active guardianship of public health systems. The final victory is not merely the absence of a disease. It is a blueprint of science, politics, and human courage for future challenges. It teaches that eradication requires tools, networks, trust, and sustained political will. It teaches that victory without vigilance can be brittle and temporary. And it insists that ordinary people, when organised and respected, change the course of history. In the clinic, Amina pins another vaccine card into the ledger and smiles. The child leaves with a parent who now knows a nurse by name. The brass plaque shines. It says what happened and what must continue to happen. Smallpox may be gone. The obligation it created remains very much alive.